Chapter 81, The Mysterious Instructions. Ooh. At the expiration of 10 days from the mysterious accouchement of Ellen Monroe, Richard Markham returned home. It was late at night when he alighted at his dwelling, but as he had written 2 days previously to say when his arrival might be expected, Mr. Monroe and Whittingham were sitting up to receive him. Richard's countenance was mournful, and he wore a black crape around his hat. "You have lost a kind friend, Richard," said Mr. Monroe. "Your hasty letter acquainted us with the fact of Mr. Armstrong's death, but you gave us no details connected with that event." "I will now tell you all that has occurred," said Richard. "Yay! Because we don't know anything either. All right. You need not leave the room, Whittingham. You knew Mr. Armstrong and will no doubt be interested in the particulars of his last moments." "I know him for a staunch and consisting man in his democratical opinions," said Whittingham. "And that what's more I always fumble over his words because he says things a little funny. "I knowed him for a staunch and consisting man in his democratical opinions," answered Whittingham. "And what's more comportant, he thought well of you, Master Richard." "He was an excellent man," observed Markham, wiping away a tear. "Worth 1,000 Chichesters and 10,000 Vulgarians which call butlers tulips," added Whittingham dogmatically. "I will tell you the particulars of his death," continued Richard after a pause. "You remember that I received a letter from Mr. Armstrong, written in a hurried manner, and desiring me to repair to him in Boulogne, where he was detained by an accident which he feared might prove fatal. I posted to Dover, which town I reached at about 5 in the evening, and I found that no packet would leave for France until the following morning. The condition of my friend, as I judged of it by his notes, seemed too serious to allow me to delay. So I accordingly hired a vessel, and proceeded without loss of time to Boulogne, where I arrived at 11 that same night, after a tolerably rough passage. I hurried to the hotel at which my friend was staying, and the card of which he had enclosed in his letter. I found him in bed, suffering from a fearful accident caused by the overturning of the chaise in which he had arrived at Boulogne from Paris, on his way to England. No limbs were broken, but he had sustained internal injuries of a most serious nature. A nurse was seated at his bedside, and his medical attendant visited him every 2 or 3 hours. He was delighted to see me, wept, and said frequently, even up to the moment of his decease, "Richard, this is very, very kind of you." I sat up with him all that night, in spite of his entreaties that I would retire to rest, and from the first moment that I set my eyes upon him in that room, I felt convinced he would never leave it alive. I need not tell you that I did all I could to solace and render comfortable the man who had selected me of all his acquaintances to receive his last breath. I considered myself honored by that mark of friendship, and I moreover remembered that he had believed in my innocence when I first told him my sad tale within the walls of Newgate. I never left him save for 1 hour, from the instant I arrived in Boulogne until that of his death. "Poor Master Richard," said Whittingham, surveying the young man with affectionate admiration. "I said that I left him for 1 hour," continued Markham. "That was the evening before his death. 5 days after my arrival, he called me to his bedside and said, 'Richard, I feel that my hours are numbered. You heard what my physician observed ere now, and I am not the man to delude myself with vain and futile hope. I repeat, my moments are now numbered. Leave me alone, Richard, for 1 hour, that I may commune with myself.' This desire was sacred, and I immediately obeyed it. But I remained away only just 1 hour, and then hastened back to him. He was very faint and languid. I saw with much surprise that he had been writing. I sat down by his bedside and took his emaciated hand. He pressed mine and said in a slow and calm tone, 'Richard, I need not recall to your mind under what circumstances we first met. I heard your tale. I knew that you were innocent. I could read your heart. In an hour I understood all your good qualities. I formed a friendship for you, and in the name of that friendship, listen to the last words of a dying man.' He paused for a few moments and then continued thus. 'When I am no more, you will take possession of the few effects that I have with me here. In my desk you will find a sum sufficient to pay all the expenses incurred by my illness and to meet the cost of my interment. I desire to be buried in the Protestant cemetery in the neighborhood. You and the physician will attend me to my grave. The funeral must be of the most humble description. Do not neglect this desire on my part. I have been all my life opposed to pomp and ostentation, and shall scarcely wish any display to mark my death. He paused again, and I gave him some refreshing beverage. He then proceeded. Beneath my pillow, Richard, there is a paper in a sealed envelope. After my death, you will open that envelope and read what is written within it. And now I must exact from you a solemn promise, a promise made to a dying man, a promise which I am not ashamed to ask, and which you need not fear to give, especially as it relates eventually to yourself. I require you to pledge yourself most sacredly that you will obey to the very letter the directions which are written within that envelope and which relate to the papers that the envelope contains. I readily gave the promise required. He then directed me to take the sealed packet from beneath his pillow and retain it safely about my person. He shortly after sank into a deep slumber from which he never awoke. His spirit glided imperceptibly away. "Good old man," exclaimed Whittingham, applying his snow-white handkerchief to his eyes. "According to the French laws," continued Richard, "interments must take place within 48 hours after death. The funeral of Thomas Armstrong was humble and unostentatious as he desired. The physician and myself alone followed him to the tomb. I then inspected his papers, but found no will, no instructions how his property was to be disposed of, and yet I knew that he was possessed of ample means. Having liquidated his debts with a portion of the money I found in his desk, and which amounted to about £100, I gave the remainder to an English charity in Boulogne. And now you are no doubt anxious to know the contents of that packet so mysteriously delivered to me. When I broke the seal of the envelope, I found a letter addressed thus: To my dear friend Richard Markham. This letter was sealed. I then examined the envelope. You shall yourselves see what was written within it." Okay, here we go. Markham took a paper from his pocket and handed it to Monroe, who read its contents aloud as follows: "Richard, remember your solemn promise to a dying man, for when I write this, I know you will not refuse to give that sacred pledge which I shall ask of you. When you are destitute of all resources, when adversity or a too generous heart shall have deprived you of all means of subsistence, and when your own exertions fail to supply your wants, open the enclosed letter. But should no circumstances of any kind deprive you of the little property which you now possess, and should you not be plunged into a state of need from which your own talents or exertion cannot relieve you, then you shall open this letter upon the morning of the 10th of July, 1843, on which day you have told me that you are to meet your brother. These directions I charge you to observe faithfully and solemnly. Thomas Armstrong." Okay, foreshadowing, right? So either Richard is going to hit a really rough patch, and this is going to come into play, or he's going to open it when he meets his brother, who I'm absolutely convinced is Mr. Montague/Greenwood. And Mr. Montague worked for Mr. Armstrong earlier on, you'll remember, and was part of the reason why Armstrong ended up in prison. So I bet he has looked into it more and found out that Montague/Greenwood is Richard's brother. Right? That's gotta be it. Okay, I think this is foreshadowing that things are about to get really complicated. "How very extraordinary," said Monroe. "Nevertheless, I have a presentiment that these mysterious instructions intend some eventual good to you, Richard." "It's a fortune, depend upon it," said the old butler. "Upon that head it is useless to speculate," observed Richard. "I shall obey to the very last letter the directions of my late friend, be their tendency what it may. And now that I have told you all that concerns myself, allow me to ask how it fares with you here. Does Ellen's health improve?" "For the last 10 days she has been confined to her bed," answered Monroe, tears starting in his eyes. "Confined to her bed?" exclaimed Markham. "I hope you have had proper medical advice." "I wished to call in the aid of a physician," said Monroe, "but Ellen would not permit me. She declared that she should soon be better. She assured me that her illness was produced only by the privations and mental tortures which she had undergone, poor creature, previous to our taking up our abode in your hospitable dwelling. And then Marian was so kind and attentive, and echoed everything which Ellen advanced so readily, that I have suffered myself to be over-persuaded." You did wrong, Mr. Monroe," exclaimed Markham. "Your daughter should have had medical advice, and she shall have it tomorrow." "She appears to be mending in health, though not in spirits," observed Monroe. "But, my dear young friend, you shall have your own way, and I thank you sincerely for the interest you show in behalf of one who is dear, very dear to me." Richard pressed the hand of the old man and retired to his chamber to seek that repose of which he stood so much in need after his journey. But ere he sought his couch, he sat down and wrote the following note to Count Alteroni, that it might be dispatched to Richmond without delay in the morning. "Mr. Markham regrets to be the means of communicating news of an afflicting nature to Count Alteroni. Nor should he intrude himself again upon Count Alteroni's notice, did he not feel himself urged by a solemn duty to do so in the present instance. Count Alteroni's old and esteemed friend, Thomas Armstrong, is no more. He departed this life 4 days ago. Mr. Markham had the melancholy honor of closing the eyes of a good man and true patriot, and of following his remains to the tomb. Okay, so that is the end of that chapter. So we know what happened to Mr. Armstrong. I am absolutely convinced this letter is going to come into play somehow, either before he meets up with his brother or the day that he does. I suspect it's going to come in beforehand, but we'll see. Ellen is physically on the mend, but not emotionally, which makes sense considering everything she's been through. We'll have to see what ends up happening with Mr. Chichester and Sir Rupert and Count Alteroni, because Richard still doesn't know about them and their lost fortune. All right, we'll see you for the next chapter.